see it.
Awesome. Okay, cool. I'm also going to have the Teams chat up just in case any questions come through. Feel free to ask. So, okay, we're going to kick it off. Thanks for joining today. It's the AKS office hours. Appreciate you being here. I know a lot of you have been with us now for, we did officially hit the year mark. I think today is a year. So we appreciate everyone who's joined along the way. Hopefully we'll be putting out a survey here soon just to gauge, your experience, any ways that we can improve the content and just the things that we're covering. But appreciate everyone and, thanks for making this so successful. So if you're new with us today, I just want to kick off by introducing myself. My name is Kendall Roden. I'm on the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team at Microsoft. Really passionate about this space, co-host on the Azure podcast. So if you're still learning about Azure or interested in some of the newer services that are coming online, definitely check that out. And would love to connect after the session via Twitter. That's definitely where you can find me. And my counterpart, Dave, is not able to be here today, but he, co-hosts, he's with me. So you'll definitely see him around if you haven't had the opportunity to meet with him before. So why do we host these? Really the goal is just to provide updates related to AKS, new features that are coming online, and just generally bringing awareness to some of the open source ecosystem around Kubernetes. And then, obviously bringing in different partners and speakers to host short talks and demos related to some of these technologies. So really excited. Today we have BoxBoat with us. After we do a quick welcome and introduction with some AKS updates and maybe a couple of ecosystem updates, we're going to pass it over to our friends at BoxBoat. My teammate Jim is also on the call, so he'll make sure that he does a good introduction of that team and what we're trying to accomplish today. And then wanted to call out that we do have an upcoming session. I know this is one that has been top of mind over the past several months, and we've had questions around it, but haven't necessarily taken the time to really dig in. So we're going to have one of our friends over on the Windows container side of the house come in and talk about just like the progress we've made in that space, any questions you might have around Windows containers, that story, especially on AKS. So keep that in mind, put that on the calendar. We're targeting for the next session, which would be October 7th. If there's any changes there, please keep in mind that the GitHub repo will be updated, but that should move forward unless anything pops up that's unexpected. All right, so let's dig into it. So I know that we didn't have a call last time, so it's been a little while since we've done some updates. We had Michael from the product group, who I believe is also here today, come on and do a great job of giving us an overview of the roadmap. All of the previous calls up to this point are available on YouTube, so they've all been, uploaded. Appreciate y'all's patience and sticking with me. I know sometimes we get backlogged a little bit, but those should all be available. So if you have questions around the roadmap or availability of new features, he just did a great job going over that. So I highly recommend checking out that video if you have any questions kind of more around what's being planned and the arrival dates of certain features. So what I wanted to go over is just a couple of the release notes that have come up since the previous session. So this release these release notes were published on September 9th. And the biggest thing I want to call out here is one of the announcements. So there's been a lot of features. Obviously, every month we're releasing new features, be it to preview or GA. And one of those features that went into preview is called scale down mode. And essentially this allows you to either delete or deallocate nodes in AKS. So obviously in our traditional experience with AKS, when we want to scale up the cluster, we need to do that manually or using the cluster autoscaler. And so as the cluster autoscaler is spinning up new nodes, we obviously have to provision those new nodes. And then as we're doing the scale down operation, it's going to delete those nodes from the cluster. And so what scale down mode allows you to do essentially is delete or deallocate nodes in the cluster when you're scaling down. So when a VM is in the stopped or deallocated state, you're not getting charged for the actual compute resources, but you will pay for things like the OS and the data storage disks that might still be associated to that VM. But it does also mean like container images, for example, will be preserved on those nodes. And so basically you don't have to pre-provision those nodes or pre-pull container images. So you can save costs from a compute perspective. And so just keep in mind, this announcement is basically related to that feature. So you need to make sure that you're setting that the scale down mode to deallocate versus delete if you wanted to kind of maintain those nodes with those attached disks, etc. Another thing here that we talked about is the AKS run command going GA. So if you're using private clusters, essentially this is really targeted at that feature specifically, and will help with things like just-in-time access to your private cluster. When the client is not on the cluster private network, but you're still basically enforcing a lot of those security controls and governance controls like RBAC and the private API server. So that's what that AKS run command should allow you to do. Excuse me. All right. Going over to the next release, so this was just about a week ago at this point. A couple of other things to note here that were announced. So Azure HPC cache can now be used with AKS clusters. So if you need to have quick access to HPC data for HPC tasks, then you can make use of these caching files via HPC cache. So we get the scalability of this cloud computing to existing workflows in AKS. So basically, we have some documentation we've released around this, but in addition to things like Azure Files and Azure Disk, you can now make use of this HPC cache feature. And then also wanted to highlight another preview feature that was released. So basically, the Cloud Controller Manager is now in public preview. A big part of this was essentially, obviously, we at Microsoft worked really closely with the Kubernetes upstream project. So basically all of the cloud provider integration with Kubernetes, like for Azure, is actually in tree. So it gets released with new releases to the Kubernetes project. So any changes to any cloud specific features has to follow the release cycle of, hey, we're releasing 122, releasing 123. So there's no way for us to basically iterate on a different timeline in relation to what the open source project is doing. And so if we need to fix issues related specifically to kind of Azure integration with Kubernetes, we're not able to do that at the cadence or the speed at which would be more convenient, right? And so now Kubernetes is kind of moving to this out of tree model, very similar if you're familiar with how we've moved to kind of the out of tree model for storage. So if you think about the new CSI drivers being moved out of tree so that you can iterate on kind of the storage integration with Kubernetes, it's very similar to that. So now cloud providers can basically control their release cycles outside of just the traditional Kubernetes release. So as of 121, CSI drivers are now the default. And then as of 122, the Cloud Controller Manager paradigm will basically be the default controller. And this will be supported by AKS. So those are just a couple of quick features and updates that I wanted to highlight. And then last but not least, there's another feature that we haven't quite touched on, and that's the public preview of custom policy definitions for AKS. So if you're familiar with Azure policy for AKS, basically all we've supported at this point is built-in policy that AKS brings to the table. So basically in the Azure portal, you'll have a collection of built-in policy that you can use with Azure policy, but now we're actually allowing you to bring your own. And this is significant because we obviously are, if you're not familiar at this point, Azure policy basically extends Gatekeeper, which is an open source or built on an open source project, basically an admission controller for the open policy agent. So it's the open policy agent implementation specifically for Kubernetes in order to allow you to essentially set up constraints and constraint templates to essentially at admission time determine if a workload is sufficient to run on your cluster or even allowed kind of from a governance perspective. So things like not deploying workloads to the default namespace or not deploying workloads from anything but a trusted registry. So we've provided some of those features already, some of those policies built in, but that was one of the Azure policy constraints in relation to the open source project for Gatekeeper is if you had already been using Gatekeeper and had written your own constraint templates or constraint custom resources, we didn't necessarily support those when moving to Azure policy built in. And so this will be really nice if you have those Rego policies, you want to bring them to Azure policy, have them managed, but still get the flexibility of Gatekeeper, then this is definitely a really positive move forward in terms of how that feature is progressing. So seems like there's some questions in the chat. I'll continue to let Michael and the rest of the team handle those as they go into ecosystem updates. And then if there are any unanswered, I'll answer those as we're moving through the presentation. So want to hop into ecosystem updates here. Just a couple of call outs that I think are relevant to note. One of them is Envoy, the Envoy proxy or the Envoy project has basically released its 5-year anniversary. And I apologize, please discount the Cilium URL. That's just old. This is an email or a template that I use. So that URL isn't relevant, but I do have the appropriate URL, and I'll make sure I drop these in the chat window as I finish. But basically, it's really cool. Matt Klein, who's worked on the project, basically goes through and talks about the evolution of the project, lessons learned. And if you're not familiar, Envoy Proxy is basically an open source edge and service proxy for cloud native applications. And a lot of the service mesh technologies are built on top of Envoy. And so I just thought that was really cool, just them diving into kind of what they've learned and really putting that in a concise format for people to digest. Another cool thing, so with the move to CSI drivers, I know that I personally have done some work with customers on kind of getting CSI drivers up and running specific to Azure Files or Azure Disk on Kubernetes or an AKS. And so I thought this was pretty neat. The CNCF did an on-demand webinar talking about the snapshot feature. So basically showing you how you can take backups of persistent volume claims, restore them in the same namespace or other namespaces, even other clusters. And so if you're interested, this is now available as a recording. And so if you're diving into CSI driver and want to dig a little bit deeper, they held that about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. Another important thing, obviously big dates, October 12th through October 15th. We've made this announcement several times, but KubeCon is coming up in addition with Cloud Native Con, kind of the collective event. It's held in Los Angeles. I know we'll have some boots on the ground there manning the booth. However, they also have the option to attend virtually. So if you haven't already, try to snag that virtual ticket. The Cube, a couple of great people that I know are involved in the Kubernetes upstream project, did a Kubernetes kind of Kubernetes KubeCon what to expect video. It's 20 minutes long, but I think it does a really good job talking about some of the planning that went into it, why they chose some of the sessions, and things to keep your eye out for. And so I will send the link here if you're interested in just kind of understanding a little bit more about what to expect in the coming weeks and as that event ramps up. Another big update here. I know we've brought up Crossplane at least a couple of times in the previous updates that we've talked through. So it's an add-on that basically enables platform teams to assemble infrastructure from multiple vendors and expose basically higher level APIs for app teams to consume without having to write code. So as we have discussions around Kubernetes, I think it's very clear we're trying to abstract more and more of the operational overhead away so that developers can focus more on application abstractions on Kubernetes. So Crossplane is an open source project that aims to do that. It's been in the CNCF for a while as a sandbox project, I think about a year, but now it has moved to incubating. And so there's some good insight into kind of some of the major updates and things that Crossplane has done in order to gain additional traction in the cloud native community. One of these is that they actually have done their release to 1.0. So this is like a major release milestone, obviously, and continuing forward, they've made a lot of improvements even from there and are now kind of being declared as a stable and ready to be used production service. And then there was another great article that came out from D2IQ on some of the trends to look out for at KubeCon. Not surprisingly, a lot of them around AI, IoT scenarios, hybrid and edge. And so I just think this is another good article to kind of supplement what you should keep your eye out for and what some of the people in this community are thinking will be cloud native trends moving forward. And then last but not least, I thought this was pretty neat. The CNCF put out a really cool kind of end user report all around Spotify. It's around 6 pages. It's a PDF. Talks about their Kubernetes journey, like how they've grown, some of the lessons they've learned, pain points they've overcome, some statistics around their usage. And so I thought that this was just a pretty neat overview and something that I think people would be interested in checking out in terms of just understand some of the growth that's happened related to that particular project. So now I'm gonna kind of just like pass over the floor to Jim, and I'll let him do a quick overview. So Jim, I'm going to pass it over to you, but I'm going to go ahead and I realized I had, there we go.
Great, thanks.
Jim, yeah, if you want to do an introduction and then we can pass it over to the presenters, I'll go ahead and stop sharing after this.
Cool, yeah, I'll turn on my, my video. So hi, everybody. My name is Jim Vacca. I'm one of the app innovation specialists on the Microsoft team, and I worked on lining up BoxBoat to come and talk today on the call in regards to the AKS health check that they've put together. So I've worked with the folks from BoxBoat for a number of years, and doing things like workshops, both customer focused workshops as well as internal ones that we've done for training for some of the folks within Microsoft. And a couple of things about these guys, this development partner that I like is, number one, I kind of consider them a Kubernetes first expert, as opposed to a partner that may be focused more on infrastructure or did some other kind of things, and then down the road decided that they needed to add Kubernetes skill set. So I kind of look at them for the capabilities that they do in Kubernetes first. Excuse my cat there. The second thing is that a lot of times when we engage with customers, it's helpful for us to work with them to go through the process of deploying their first Kubernetes application, and they gain experience doing that. But a lot of times a customer is very new to just container development, Kubernetes in general, et cetera. And so another piece that I like about BoxBoat is that they do offer training, which I don't know why, but for some reason it seems to be kind of hard to find these days with a lot of the consulting companies. So those are just a couple ways in which that I've worked with these guys over the years. So as in part of those number of engagements that they've done, they've gone through and they've worked with customers to kind of understand, hey, is your environment, running all the best practices that are out there? And so they put together a health check. I won't go into the details on that. I'll turn it over to the BoxBoat team. We originally lined up both Facundo and Natalie. Natalie's not able to join us today, so it's just going to be Facundo running the show. So no pressure on you for the session, Facundo. But we'll turn it over to them and let them go ahead and run through and explain the health check. And Facundo, I know you've got a full agenda. One question that I got asked as I was advertising this session is, what are the best ways for folks to sort of engage with you if they want to have your services to run the health check? So if that's something you can address as you're going through too, I know that would be helpful for a lot of the folks.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Jim. Let me share. All right. So everybody hopefully can see my slides. Apparently my primary camera is not working today, so no face today. So essentially, I'm really happy to be here and explain to you a little bit of the work that we've been doing. And specifically, this is sort of an open source project that we created trying to give back to the AKS community. My name is Facundo. I'm a solutions architect at BoxBoat. I'm also the Azure practice lead at BoxBoat, and I've been in the DevOps space for a number of years. As Jim was talking about, we're essentially a boutique consulting company that's focused on Kubernetes. We are a Microsoft Gold partner and a Kubernetes certified service provider. I just wanted to share this. I know this is not necessarily kind of a business call. It's more of a community call, but I just wanted to share this to provide some context about who we are and why we're here. A bit more context as well. We recently got acquired by IBM. And so now we are essentially BoxBoat and IBM company. This happened recently, about 2 months ago or so. And what this really means for us is that we are going to be spending a bit more time on OpenShift as well. So at least for the Azure practice, it means that we're going to be doing quite a bit of AKS and Azure Red Hat OpenShift. So enough about us. And I just want to talk to you about the AKS Health Check. So what it is essentially a consulting engagement where we quickly assess a cluster and the configuration and ensure that it's following best practices. And as an outcome of this consulting engagement, we provide a document stating the recommendations on what to fix. And by quickly, I mean that essentially we don't have to wait around for access. We don't have to wait for a client laptop or anything like that. And typically, we don't have to set up a long working session with one of the engineers on the customer side, because one of the things that I'll share with you is that we created a companion CLI tool that runs within a container. and it performs a lot of the automated checks in our behalf so that we don't have to sit there and essentially be hands-on examining an environment. So probably the most important thing that you will probably take away from this talk is that the material for the consulting engagement that we created is completely open source and you're free to use it. And what this means is that there is a template document that we use to provide our customers with the recommendations of all the things that they could fix, along with references to the Microsoft documentation. And to go along with that, there is a companion CLI tool that we use to essentially cross-reference with a templated document and do a lot of the legwork for us. The goal of this consulting engagement is really to help those really busy organizations that don't necessarily have the time to dig through the Microsoft best practices, that maybe they're trying to go live to production at some point and they just don't have the time to slow down. So we're looking to show up, provide a whole lot of value for them, and point them in the right direction to address the biggest things that they have in terms of their infrastructure. Let me back up for a second and tell you a little bit of context about how we came up to this point, and definitely give credit where it's due, especially since this was kind of inspired by different community projects. So let me pivot here to my browser. And if you've been plugged into the AKS community, you probably have heard of this project. This is the AKS Checklist. Is a really good project that essentially grabs a lot of the Microsoft's best practices and puts it in a checklist format. Kind of the engine for this open source project was inspired, I think, by some type of front-end checklist project, and somebody thought this was a really cool format and they could use this to leverage it for AKS. So when we initially saw this project, we got really excited because as BoxBoat, we did a lot of assessments that took a lot of time, a lot of interviewing, and a lot of time spending, kind of creating massive Word documents with a lot of details. And that was work that was being repeated on a client per client basis. And it just took a lot of time to try to get to that finished result that the client wanted, which was the written recommendations. So when we saw this, we felt like we could use this as a point to reduce kind of the engagement time and maximize the value for our customers. And especially since, it's very much driven off of the Microsoft best practices. And at the end here, you can see that you can generate a report, and it will give you a report of all the recommendations, and it will even give you a grade of where you are. So what essentially happened was that we formed the consulting engagement being inspired by this really cool project. And when we scheduled a lot of these engagements with past clients, we quickly ran into kind of execution issues where if we wanted to provide a more nuanced answer, so if we looked at this recommendation and say, we wanted to say something or elaborate on this recommendation, and we wanted to say, why they failed this check, or why they passed that check, or yes, but, or no, but, we were not able to give that nuanced answer because the format of this being a web page and how it's built is just a checklist, right? So you either pass it or you fail it. And we felt like that was really critical information. So as we started delivering these health check engagements, we essentially started over by simply going to essentially a Google document. So I'll share with you again throughout this talk, but essentially, again, all the material is open source. The source code for the companion tool, as I'll walk you through in a bit, is open source as well. And the templated document is public for you to use as well. Okay, so this is a template document, and it is truly just a document. templatized so that we can quickly run through this and write reasons of why something must have passed or failed, right? And then we have templates of, you can remove words here, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. The other thing I want to highlight here in this templated document is we also have a code per best practice recommendation here, so that with the companion tool, we're able to quickly reference the code and fill in the reasons of why something must have passed or failed given the recommendation from the tool itself. Those checks that are automated have a star next to them, and any check that does not have a star next to it is essentially a lot more subjective, and it requires kind of more context about what application you're trying to host on Kubernetes, or whether it's even important for your company, right? So a lot of these are very open-ended, and those don't necessarily have a place where we can just quickly automate them. Okay, so what I can show you now is essentially how you can perform this health check on your own. You will have to become familiar with the AKS best practices. So I guess kind of the value add of engaging a company like BoxBoat is that, we've seen different Kubernetes deployments across different enterprises, right? So the time to essentially perform this will be a lot quicker than if you are having to become familiar with the best practices from scratch. So anyway, so if you want to perform a health check, you simply clone the document, and hopefully that was a clone. Yeah, this is a copy. There we go. So essentially what you do is you go down the recommendations, and if it's automated, right, then you likely just want to wait until you run the tool, and the tool will tell you where the passed or failed. If it's not automated, it's simply just having a discussion and making an assessment, a judgment call on whether or not something passed or failed. So let's say this passed, then typically what we do is we just remove some words. Then, we color this green. There we go, that's green. So this one is good to go, and then we'll provide a reason of why this passed or failed, right? So let me pivot to the companion tool. So again, this is open source. It's written in JavaScript because that's the thing that we're most familiar for the two main BoxBoaters that worked on this. Essentially, the easy option is option A, and what you have to do is run a Docker container. The image is published to the GitHub container registry, so it is free to download. And essentially, you just shell into it, because what you're going to do is you're going to authenticate as yourself to Azure and to AKS. Before you run the health check itself, please select the proper subscription where your cluster is located. Then you're likely going to connect to that cluster and ensure that you can do kubectl commands. So this is just a validation step to make sure that you're connected properly. And then the tool is just baked into that container. So the name of the tool is AKS Health Check, or HC for short. Check all. Then you give it the resource group, and you give it the name of the cluster, and likely what namespaces you want to ignore. So for some of those checks, like liveness probes, readiness probes, maybe you want to ignore the Nginx ingress controller pods, so that you don't have any false negatives, right? And you can truly scope this to only the applications running within your cluster. Optionally, I guess one of the main differences between this health check and some of the other community-based diagnostics tool is that this one also looks at some of the Azure resources. So the reason why this subcommand is check all is because you can isolate checks between Kubernetes and Azure checks. And an example of an Azure check, right, is whether or not you want the health check to look at also the configuration for any Azure container registries, looking for private endpoints, whitelist rules, and things like that, right? And I believe one of the latest ones we added was geo-replication of the container registry. Okay, so that's pretty much kind of the instructions of how you run the health check. Let me show you the output of a health check that I just ran this morning, and it was a kind of an example one, right? But what I did was essentially I created a new cluster, AZ AKS create, very much a vanilla cluster, and we ran the health check against this cluster. And you can see that quite a bit of checks have failed. So right here it says that only 10 out of 22 automated checks passed, 9 have failed, the other were likely needs manual inspection. So the output looks like this, and as I was mentioning, each recommendation is going to have a code so that you can cross-reference it with the templated document. If it fails, sometimes it's going to give you a reason why it fails. And really, all it's meant to do is just give you cut some time on some of the legwork that you have to do when you're performing a health check on your own environment. If you need a link to the document, you can find it here again. It's also part of the GitHub repo. It's pretty much everywhere. Okay, so let me switch back to the slides here, and I can talk about maybe some examples of the health checks. So this is an example of a health check that we ran for kind of a newer customer of ours. And what they were looking to do, they were experimenting with AKS. They were in the beginning stages of AKS. They were in the planning stages of hosting a very important API on top of their cluster. And they essentially just went through the documents and created a very simple cluster to host their prototype. Because they were looking to go live sometime in the end of this year, we felt like they could use some help with establishing what they need to fix before they go live. And if we drilled into some of the top recommendations here, one of them is very basic, right? How do you keep your Kubernetes version up to date? They didn't necessarily have that planned out or worked out, so a lot of these like basic operational concerns of AKS, that they didn't necessarily have figured out. So we recommended that they should figure that out. Another one here for them specifically was isolating the Kubernetes API so that only a few admins could reach that API, given the kind of workload that they were looking to plan and host on that cluster. They didn't necessarily have whitelist IP whitelist enabled on that API server on AKS. And then the last one for them, right, is consider using a WAF, given that it's going to be a web application, and given the context of that application and the security requirements for it, we felt like that they could use a WAF. This is another example of another customer that we helped. They were a lot more advanced. So they've been a long time customer of ours, probably early user of AKS. For them, they have a multi-regional setup of, I think, 3 different clusters spread across the US. And they have traffic manager in front of the applications for those clusters. So they were quite advanced, and they took reliability very seriously. We found the gap going through the checklist that their container registry, although it was a premium SKU, it was not being geo-replicated. So potentially, right, if their primary Azure region went down, took down their container registry, they would likely not be able to perform any kind of new deployments on the applications running within that cluster. Then the rest of the other recommendations were more security focused. They were planning on hosting some more sensitive applications on top of that cluster that required PCI compliance. So we felt like they could strengthen the security posture for that cluster, and at the very least start with some of the Azure native services like Azure Security Center to start, augmenting their capabilities there. Okay. I already talked a little bit about how to run a health check, so I'm going to skip over this part. And I can pivot into a bit of the roadmap and what's next for this health check. So first off, we're going to look to make some improvements on the logging of the tool itself. It's been an iteration process to try to get this right and get it to the place that it is today. We feel like maybe there's a way to better show any kinds of issues. If there's issues running a check over a particular check fails, we feel like the logging could be a little bit better. Also, planning for future things, if there's a need for it as well, is kind of decoupling the way that we present the results with the way that we generate the results. So maybe if we introduce like an intermediate JSON results file, then possibly we are able to get a lot more smart about the way that we present the results from the companion tool. We also bounced ideas around this, but not too much. Maybe it could be useful to start figuring out a way how to scaffold that templated document that I shared with you and pre-fill it with information. So that could be a neat thing to do. Some of our customers are a lot more sensitive to security. We do have container image scanning driven by SNCC right now on the public containers, but we are always looking to, figure out ways on how to strengthen the security posture of this companion tool. Even though it does not necessarily modify anything in the cluster, everything is read-only commands. We just want to give that extra step of assurance to the people that run it. So maybe there is something to be said about running this pod within the cluster and then creating a custom rule so that it's a read-only kind of permissions against the Kube API. We're still working through that one. I'm not sure if it's gonna happen, but we're happy to hear any feedback. If you find that important, we were taking contributions and happy to chat about it. And the last thing is, because we're acquired by IBM, like I said before, there's going to be more OpenShift in our future. So maybe there is an opportunity to do something similar for Azure Red Hat OpenShift and create a very similar project specifically for ARO. Some notable mentions about other projects that are very similar to this one. So I already talked about the AKS Checklist. It's a really great project maintained by really cool people. We had a few conversations. Happy to have more conversations with them. If you haven't checked it out, feel free to check it out. It's a really cool project. There's also Popeye. Popeye is very popular. It's very well maintained as well. Popeye is being kind of advertised as a cluster sanitizer. A lot of our BoxBoaters have used it before and they like it a lot. I think the biggest difference is that it is just a tool, right? An extension of kubectl, but it only inspects for things within the Kubernetes plane as opposed to Kubernetes in the Azure plane. So if you want to help with this project, just start an issue on GitHub. We're very happy to chat with you and collaborate. If you want kind of help on running this health check for your enterprise and doing it in the behalf of you, feel free to go to boxboat.com and submit the contact form to request help for us kind of doing this engagement in your behalf. But again, if you feel free, if you want to do it yourself, you are welcome to do it yourself. And if you want to help us out, you are very welcome to help us out. And having said that, shout out to Pixel Robots. Richard, I saw you in the chat. Very friendly guy. Thank you for all your contributions. Richard has made the template document a lot better. He's submitted a few bug fixes as well to the companion tool, and we've been having really cool discussions through GitHub issues. So I know we haven't officially met, but I'm really appreciative of your help. So thank you so much, and thank you to the GBB team for having us today. So that's it for today.
Yeah, thanks. So sorry. It took me a second for my teams to come off mute. So does anybody have any questions around this at this point? Just want to make sure that we take advantage of having the BoxBoat team here while we can. Awesome. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. Happy Thursday. I dropped the ecosystem updates in the chat, so feel free if you're interested in kind of checking out some of those links that I mentioned before. I'll drop it one more time just so that you have quick access, but I appreciate the great conversation and all the people that helped answer questions in the chat as well. And we're looking forward to seeing y'all again next time for some great Windows containers content. So with that being said, we'll get this video uploaded and I will do it today. And then we will see you next time. Oh, it looks like there might be a question. Nolan, do you want to come off mute?
Hi, Kendall. I just had a quick question for you. There's an open issue in the GitHub repo about your contact me mailing list not accepting external emails that's been open since March.
Yeah.
It looks like that still hasn't been resolved. I attempted to send a question for one of the office hours a few weeks ago and got my my mail bounced back. So maybe if you guys could investigate that and resolve that, might fix some other people's problems.
Yeah, so we created it to accept external, and unfortunately the website where you can create those is on Windows, and I just haven't got my Windows machine out in a while, to be honest. So yeah, I'll make sure that I get that resolved as well. I appreciate you resurfacing that. But in the meantime, if there are any questions that come out of today, feel free to just email me directly, and I'll drop my email in the chat window. But we'll try to get that fixed so that y'all can actually email the DL. Thanks for that call out. All right, awesome. Thanks everyone. I appreciate it. I'll make sure I get those things checked into the repo today. And Nolan, I'll bring up the old machine and see if there's something I can do. And maybe I'll even reach out to you directly to see if you're able to send an email. All right, awesome. Thanks everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.